Soul Pirate, Book 1 in a Restless Soul series by V.J. Dunn. Chapter 1, Bad Things Happen to Good People.
Nothing could have prepared Dalton for the outright fury he faced. The jeers, the sneers, and the near violence was shocking, especially since it came from his own congregation. "You said we'd be out of here," a man shouted. Dalton thought it was JC, but he couldn't be sure, not with the cacophony of voices. Even though the man was the head deacon for their church, it didn't seem to matter. They were all bent on hating their pastor. "Now, just calm down," Dalton said with a wince. The words were lame and he knew it, but he really had no idea what else to say. Truthfully, he felt the same as the church did. Confused, disillusioned, betrayed. He realized his shoulders were drooping, a sign of defeat. Forcing them back, Dalton tried to show the church he was confident, unafraid, unconcerned. Nothing could have been further from the truth. "I know times are hard," he said with another wince and another feeling that he had failed. "But we have to come together. We have to—" He was interrupted by another shout. "You lied to us!" Dalton's eyes widened when he saw that the angry accusation came from Carolyn. She'd been his assistant for over 10 years. They'd shared stories, family tragedies, countless lunches, and Bible study notes. Carolyn was his friend. Next to his wife, she was his closest confidant. Or so he thought. Heart aching, Dalton stiffened his spine further. "Look, I know that we're all upset." His fingers flexed into the edges of his pulpit, something he had done countless times over the past 18 years, though never because he'd been seeking comfort from the sturdiness of the oak. "We need to stick together. More now than ever." The cliché was never more true than in that moment, but Dalton knew as soon as the words left his lips that they were going to be inflammatory. He was right. "Stick together?" someone shouted. "When we're all starving and can't even get our prescription medicines?" "Yeah," another voice yelled. "All these years you told us that we'd be out of here before all this crap happened, and now look where we are." Angry voices rose in agreement. Dalton's fingers pressed tighter into the wood as he leaned forward. This wasn't how he'd pictured the meeting going. He thought the congregation would come together, would lift one another and offer to help those who needed it most. Never did he think they'd become a lynch mob. "What else did you lie to us about?" someone else yelled out. More agreement followed. "He probably lied about everything." Dalton frowned when he realized that had come from Mama Brown, the oldest of the church members. Just 10 months before, they'd celebrated her 90th birthday. Back before it became evident that everything had truly fallen apart and was never going to recover. The crowd grew more uproarious, to the point Dalton was beginning to worry. He glanced at his wife, but she seemed intent on staring at the carpet beneath her feet. "Please, look at me," he silently begged. "I need your support right now." But he doubted that support would come. Becca had been just as angry, just as accusatory as the rest of the congregation once it was obvious he'd been wrong. At that moment, Dalton knew he was on his own. Becca's apathy toward him wasn't new. Ever since their only child had succumbed to leukemia 2 years prior, his wife had been distant, lost to her grief. After the bitterness of the grieving process faded, the anger had come. And the blame. Everyone was at fault. Dalton, the doctors, even God. Becca was no longer a helpmate. She was too lost in her pain. "Look," he said as he patted the air with his hands, "let's just calm down. I know everything is hard now. But like I said, we have to come together. We have to rely on each other to survive." "Why do we have to go through this BS?" The angry voice came from the back. "What about God loves us too much to let us go through the tribulation?" they added with a sneer. "Yeah," someone else called out. "Pretty obvious we're right in the middle of it." Dalton gripped the pulpit again, sure that the wood was going to crack beneath his fingers from the pressure. "I might need the wood splinters for a weapon," he thought a bit hysterically. "I know, but—" He was interrupted once again. "Guess that means God doesn't really love us after all," Patsy yelled. Dalton blinked a few times in shock at the woman who'd led the children's church since he himself had been a kid. She'd always been the most soft-spoken, kindest woman he'd ever known. Becca's voice broke through. "Maybe he doesn't even exist after all." That quiet statement momentarily hushed the crowd. Dalton looked back at his wife, who continued to keep her eyes glued to the carpet before her, unable or unwilling to meet his pleading look. Her nearly whispered comments seemed to reverberate across the hostile congregation, and Dalton knew everyone heard it. He held his breath as his heart pounded within his chest while he watched the words seep into the crowd's consciousness, like an oppressive fog. In that fateful moment, he swore he could hear the thoughts. Is it true? What if everything is a lie? All these years trying to be good, trying to do the right thing, and for what? Defeat weighed on his shoulders again, and Dalton didn't bother trying to keep a strong front. Why bother? He felt the same way they did. He didn't think he could take any more of the accusatory stares, and he certainly didn't like any of the veiled threats being thrown his way either. The only thing standing between him and what was quickly becoming an angry mob was the oak pulpit, which seemed to shrink in size with each accusation. Dalton flinched as more indictments were hurled his way, many with curses that had likely never been spoken before in the sanctuary. While most of the accusations were true, they really weren't fair. Didn't they realize he was in the same boat they were? He didn't have any answers either, but he knew the congregation had always looked to him to have the knowledge they lacked, to explain the scriptures that they were too lazy to look up themselves. He'd spent hours upon hours every week poring over his Bible, studying and preparing sermons they likely wouldn't even listen to. The brethren certainly didn't appreciate the effort. Most of them barely stayed awake during his sermons. But despite the apathy, despite the spiritual laziness of the congregation, Dalton had loved them, had given his all to pastor them in the best way he knew how. And for what? Just so they could blame him for the current state of affairs. It made his chest ache, but it also angered him, he realized, as his grip tightened even further on the pulpit's sides. All that time he'd unselfishly given to them. The hospital visits, the weddings, funerals, baby dedications and baptisms, home visits, marriage counseling, family guidance, the heartfelt sermons he'd fervently preached, all for nothing. They'd all turned on him. Not a single member of the congregation was willing to stand with him. But he told himself their fear was understandable. He himself wasn't sure of anything any longer. Like the angry congregation before him, he was doubting everything he'd ever believed in. He had no explanation for why they were still here, no idea of what was happening or why. It went against everything he believed in, everything he'd learned in seminary, and everything that he'd taught from the pulpit all those years. He knew they all should have been gone by now, should have been with the Lord before the hard times started. In that moment, they should have been at the bride's banquet table and not left on earth to suffer through all the insanity and chaos swirling around them. It made no sense and went against everything he'd believed. There was only one thing Dalton was sure of. He was all alone. Chapter 2. The Darkness Around Us. Smoke rose from the burning building, along with embers that drifted into the dry grass. Fires were burning everywhere now. Smoke, ash, and unbreathable air had become the norm. Worse, with the heat and fires so prevalent, water was scarce and had quickly become a commodity for those bent on taking advantage. It was the one commonality that drove people to madness. Bathing was a non-existent luxury, and often there wasn't even water to drink. It was a bit terrifying. But starvation was definitely a concern as well. Since the demise of the American dollar, people had taken to trading whatever they had just to get scraps of something to eat. But there was little food to be found, and when it was available, most people had very little left to offer for it. Sadly, many turned to the one thing they had left to trade. It was unthinkable. But families were forcing wives, sisters, and even their young daughters to offer themselves for food and medicines. Even more despicably, for drugs and alcohol. Society had completely fallen apart and evil reigned supreme. Dalton had lost count of how many days he'd been wandering. It was easy to lose track when there was no direction, no purpose. He just meandered, looking for something. Anything. Anything was better than the nothingness that he found himself surrounded by. He had no idea where he was going, or even where he was at, for that matter. Avoiding the main thoroughfares was necessary, which meant no road or town signs, but being lost was a fair trade for avoiding the gangs of criminals who patrolled the main roads. He'd run into a few of them. Dalton had managed to escape, but barely. One group he'd come across wanted him to strip, to give them all his clothes, including his boots. Dalton wasn't even sure how he managed to escape with just a broken nose, but he was thankful he had. He thought he might be somewhere around Utah, judging by the red rocks that had towered above him before he'd come across the burning building. It looked like it might have been a visitor center or some such, but there was no telling since it was just a flaming hull. There wasn't a scavenging opportunity with the building completely engulfed, so he continued trudging down the crumbling asphalt road that wasn't wide enough for two vehicles to pass as it wound through the red rock and desert landscape. Considering the different types of cacti, he could have been in Arizona too. There was really no telling. The sky was gray as usual. That was the norm now. Gray skies clouded with smoke and ash. From what he'd heard, Dalton figured the smog was from the countless fires that caused it. Although there was speculation some nuclear bombs had been deployed somewhere, probably the Middle East. Maybe the smog is nuclear fallout, Dalton wondered. There would be no protection from that. Dalton had taken to wearing a scarf around his face thanks to the smoky atmosphere. It wasn't much, but it helped to keep at least the thick ash out of his lungs. It wasn't doing much good. He'd been coughing for weeks. He figured he was probably going to die of lung cancer, even though he'd never smoked a day in his life. At the moment, dying seemed like a really good idea. Dalton sighed at his thoughts. His faith had most certainly wavered over the past months, weeks. Again, time seemed irrelevant now that the world had been flipped upside down. Regardless of how long it had been, Dalton no longer knew what he believed in. No, that isn't true, he corrected himself. There were a lot of things he believed in. Death, criminals, unending thirst, a gut that never seemed to fill, and evil. He definitely believed in evil. In all his years of pastoring, Dalton had mostly skipped over the fire and brimstone teaching. That wasn't what the congregation wanted to hear. No, they wanted their ears tickled. They wanted the smoke and lights in a fancy worship service, the happy, joy preacher who only spoke of God's unending love for them. Though he was no longer sure there even was a God, Dalton regretted not warning the congregation of the bad things in the world, what he'd always called sin. Now, more than ever, it was obvious that evil ruled the world. He turned when his ears caught a noise, an engine of some sort in the distance. Though he could tell it was far away, it was loud. Diesel, most likely. Dalton darted behind a tall cactus to take cover. He'd learned early on to wear neutral colors and had traded all his Broncos t-shirts for cans of tuna. Navy and orange were not very good camouflage colors for the desert, especially not since the desert was now charcoal gray from past fires, or red from those currently burning. Dalton pulled his hood up, even though it was hot. He never removed his hoodie that had once been a forest green, but was now a greenish gray. The thing blended in so well with most of the landscape and had recently kept him hidden from some machete-wielding outlaws who had been trying to find him hidden among some brush. There was no telling what they were after. And it wasn't always what he carried with him. Sometimes they just wanted him. Sodom and Gomorrah had begun to look like Disneyland in comparison. The sound of the motor drew nearer, and he pushed as close as he could to the cactus, wincing when needles poked through his clothing. The last thing he needed was a deep puncture. First aid kits were few and far between and cost more to trade than he possessed. Rumbling echoed through the red rocks behind him, and Dalton wondered if there was more than one vehicle coming down the desolate road. He risked peeking out under one of the cactus's arms, but whatever was coming his way wasn't in sight yet. He sucked in a deep breath, through the gray scarf covering his face, instantly regretting it when his lungs seized, and he started coughing. He fought to hold it back, trying to cough quietly in short bursts, but his body protested. The best he could do was shove his face inside his hoodie and cover it with his arms to muffle the sound. It was several moments before the need to hack up his lungs subsided, and Dalton dropped his arms, then lifted his head from his jacket. The movement made him wince as his ribs ached. The painful coughing fits were draining on his body and left him even weaker than his constant state of near starvation did. And then he nearly jumped when he saw a man standing not 3 feet away. Chapter 3. Running on empty. Beyond the man, a large truck sat waiting on the road. A semi, but without the trailer, the kind that had the sleeper behind the seats. It was still running, and Dalton wondered where he'd gotten the fuel. "You okay, man?" the guy asked, his voice muffled by the cloth he had tied around his face. Often after a bout of coughing, Dalton lost his voice. The laryngitis could last for days. He nodded, not trusting his voice as he warily studied the man before him. He was large, though much thinner than he would have normally been. Dalton got the impression of him once having linebacker shoulders and maybe a beer belly. His frame would certainly have supported both. The man looked around the sparsely landscaped area before turning his eyes back to Dalton. "You alone?" Dalton felt the hairs on the back of his neck prick up at the question. Just the year before, the same question in the same circumstance would have made him uneasy, but not in the way he was now. Now he wanted to tear across the desert as fast as he could. But it was growing dark, and he'd learned the hard way just days before that running in the dark was never a good idea. He was thankful for his sturdy boots, or else he'd likely be hobbled by a broken ankle. Rather than answering, Dalton put his hand in his pocket like he'd seen others do who'd been threatening him. The difference was, he didn't have a weapon in his pocket. Instead, his fingers brushed over the scrap of ribbon, the only physical memory he had left of his daughter. Becca hadn't even known he had kept it. She'd been too insane with grief at the hospital to notice that he'd slipped it off Ariel's braid. Dalton tried to look intimidating, but he doubted it worked. He'd never been the type to make others feel uncomfortable. Average size, average looks, everything about him was average. His looks had been perfect for his role as a pastor, but for a loner trying to survive in the harsh, unforgiving world, not so much. The corners of the man's eyes crinkled, but with most of his face covered, Dalton couldn't tell if it was due to anger, fear, or if he was laughing at him. Probably the latter. "How about you just give me that backpack there and I'll let you go on your way? No one gets hurt," the man said, like he was reasonably offering a solution to a problem. For the briefest moment, Dalton felt a stab of compassion for the guy wanting to rob him. He supposed it came from a lifetime of trying to adhere to Christian values, in trying to understand and empathize with his fellow man. But the time they lived in was not an age where compassionate people survived. Still, scavenging, stealing, even killing had meant survival for people who found themselves with absolutely nothing left. Unlike the stories in the history books he'd read as a kid, nowadays tough times brought out the worst in humanity. But realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come. For people will be ungrateful, unholy, unloving. Dalton swallowed against the acid that rose in his throat whenever he recalled Scripture. Memorizing all those verses over the years had gotten him absolutely nowhere. He didn't answer the man, but took a step back, still hoping the man thought the ribbon he held inside his pocket was a weapon. For the 100th time since he'd been a wanderer, he wished he did have a weapon. A knife, a gun, a club, anything that could help him defend himself. "And I spent all those years preaching pacifism," he half-heartedly laughed to himself. The man stared at him, as if trying to make a decision. Dalton didn't take his eye off him as he bent to retrieve his backpack, then shouldered it. He straightened, willing his thin frame to look larger. Frightening. "It didn't work." "Hand it over," the stranger said as he put his hand out. All traces of being reasonable or pleasant were gone. Dalton took another step back, then another. The man followed. He tried to force his mind to think of a solution, but just like the other times he'd been cornered by those who'd wanted something from him, Dalton's mind just blanked. He still had no idea how he'd gotten out of the other situations. "I could take my chances and run," he thought. The ground looked pretty flat. Hopefully there aren't too many snake holes or rocks. Another step back. Another step forward for his antagonist. "I could maybe grab a rock and bash it over his head," he thought, even as the idea brought bile up into his throat again. He'd never been a violent person, and the sight of blood was pretty nauseating, but desperate times, desperate measures, and all that. He glanced down, hoping to spot a rock big enough to do some damage, but small enough he could hold it in his hand. But there was nothing, just sand and burned brush. The man cursed. "Just give me the pack," he growled, then reached into his own pocket and pulled out a knife. It was only a pocket knife, but it was a more formidable weapon than Dalton's hair ribbon. "Come on, dude, hand it over or else I'm gonna—" "Henry, hurry, it's time!" The woman's voice calling from the idling truck drew both their attention. The man looked over his shoulder, then back at Dalton, and to his pack. Dalton took that as his cue to leave, so he turned and started jogging away. Cursing again, Dalton didn't bother looking behind him to see if the man had followed. He was certain he hadn't. He was also just as sure that the woman in the truck was about to have a baby. He recognized the painful desperation in her voice as she begged her husband to come back. "Good luck raising a baby in this world," he rasped, his voice a crackly whisper. He knew the man didn't hear, nor did he mean for him to. "You're gonna need it." Dalton slowed his pace to a walk as he thought about all the things that had changed since the night his former friends and brethren had all but run him out of town. Wishing someone luck was something he never would have done. He'd never believed in luck, only in blessings and curses. But with his faith practically non-existent, he was starting to think luck was real, and he was on the wrong side of it. Dalton moved farther into the desert toward the base of the towering rocks. He kept moving parallel to the road, though, because he didn't want to get lost. He snorted at that. "Like I know where I'm going," he whispered. But still, though he didn't want to be around others, he also didn't want to be completely away from civilization. He was still holding out hope he'd find someone, anyone, who just wanted to survive and not do so by stealing and murdering. There had to be good people still out there somewhere. Once it grew completely dark as it got anyway, what with fires burning everywhere, Dalton found a low-growing bush and dropped to the ground with a tired sigh. That was the one thing he could guarantee he'd be each and every day. Tired. He pulled out a sweatshirt and balled it into a makeshift pillow, then placed it on top of his pack as he settled in for the night. But despite his utter exhaustion, he didn't sleep for a long time. With a growling stomach, it was difficult to drift off. Plus, he kept his ear tuned to the creatures of the night, wondering if any were going to head his way for a midnight meal. But once everything fell apart, the animals seemed to sort of disappear. Like good people with morals, they were few and far between. All but the snakes. It was one reason Dalton traveled during the day. He knew before that snakes liked warmth and were more likely to be out during the day, but since it was hot all the time, that theory no longer held much credence. Traveling during the day meant he had a better chance of seeing the slitheries. With the smog above, it was like a blanket keeping the earth warm. Hot, actually. But maybe not all the earth. He'd heard rumors of an island off the coast of South America on the Pacific side that welcomed refugees trying to escape from the roamers. Those with criminal intent who ran in packs. The island was supposed to be a haven for those who wanted to just survive the disaster that had swamped over the globe. The place was supposed to be a virtual paradise, free from fires that seemed to burn for no reason, free from smoky air, and free from desperate people who didn't care who they hurt to get what they needed. Dalton decided he had a destination in mind. Somewhere off the coast of South America, he laugh-whispered to himself, should be easy to find. With thoughts of cool ocean breezes and coconut water, Dalton drifted off. Chapter 4. Unexpected Savior. Mister, wake up! Dalton blinked a few times as confusion settled into his foggy brain. What is it? He croaked as he tried to get his eyes to focus. A dark shape loomed above him and an adrenaline surge chased all the fog away. He pushed himself back, but was caught by the bush he'd slept under. Roamers, the shape whispered, just over that hill. Dalton had the impression of the man, he assumed it was a male, though it was hard to tell just by a whisper, gesturing to the west. It was so dark, though, he had no idea how far away the supposed roamers were. But then he heard laughter. Come on, the man urged as he grabbed Dalton's arm and pulled him up. Dalton didn't question anything. Not the fact that his rescuer could be a roamer himself, or that the man was a loner who would just as soon stick a knife in Dalton's belly. The fear of being captured by a criminal gang overrode any fear he had of a lone human. Over here, the man said. Dalton grabbed his backpack and sweatshirt as he followed the whispering voice into the dark. Watch your step. There's a bunch of rocks. Of course there are, Dalton thought to himself. Rocks everywhere, just not where and when he needed them. Hurry, the unknown man urged. Dalton wasn't sure why he followed him. Maybe he was just foggy from sleep and not thinking right. Or maybe this is all a dream. They moved silently through the dark desert for a long time until a dark shape loomed in front of them. Dalton squinted, trying to make out what it was. It was somewhat rectangular, with a sharply sloping top, a structure of some kind. Here, the man said as something jangled. Dalton recognized the sound of keys, of a lock being turned. He stiffened, unwilling to trust the man any longer. He seemed to sense his reticence. It's all right, he said with a soothing voice. I won't harm you. I'm here to help. Dalton realized the voice had come from inside the structure and startled when he heard the sound of a match striking, then watched as the little flame became a bigger flame when a candle was lit. Come in, the man said. I have some food and water. Just the mention of water moved Dalton's feet before he thought twice. It had been a full day since he'd had anything to drink, and his mouth was so dry his tongue was stuck to the roof of his mouth. Even if he hadn't had the laryngitis, he doubted he'd be able to speak thanks to that. Sit down, the man said in a kind voice. Dalton hesitated for a moment, but the little building was so much cooler than the outside that he couldn't help himself and stepped further inside. Though the candle's light was dim, Dalton was able to make out the man's features. Somewhat. He could tell that the man was dark, very dark, and completely bald, though he had a black beard speckled with gray. Dalton moved to a little table with 2 chairs near a wall and sat while looking around as he pulled his face scarf down. The building seemed to be a hut of some sort, like a hunting cabin. One room with a table, a small sofa, a single cot-style bed, and a tiny kitchen all crammed into the living space. It was a mansion compared to some of the places he'd found himself in the past few weeks. The man moved into the kitchen area and rummaged around. He was beyond the light of the candle, and Dalton wondered how he could see what he was doing. Clinking of metal preceded the splashing of water, and Dalton tensed, barely able to stop himself from leaping up to grab the cup and gulp it down. Shuffling feet moved toward him, and Dalton watched the man come into view once again. He smiled, white teeth startling against the dark, then set a cup in front of him. Dalton tried to thank him, but his voice didn't cooperate. He lifted the cup to his parched lips with a shaking hand and gulped the contents down. He didn't think he'd ever tasted water so delicious, so pure before. There's plenty more, the strange man told him as he moved back to the kitchen area, returning with a metal pitcher. The light of the candle glinted on the surface of the pitcher and the cups, and Dalton frowned. His voice came out as a mere croak, and he tried to clear his throat, but it was still too dry. The man smiled and lifted the shiny pitcher, pouring more water into his cup. Dalton tried to thank him, but it too came out as barely more than a rasp. He took another drink, realizing that the water was cold. It was a shock to his system. For the past year, all anyone had was warm liquid at best. Refrigeration was a thing of the past. Ice, a distant memory. "Thank you," he managed to whisper, then put a hand to his throat. "Laryngitis," he explained. The man nodded, then reached across the table. Dalton took his hand, shaking it. "Jeremiah," he said. "Jeremiah Johnson." Chapter 5. Light in the Darkness. Dalton couldn't help the laugh that escaped him, though it was barely more than a whispery huff. Jeremiah frowned slightly, head tipped in confusion. "Sorry," Dalton croaked. "Jeremiah Johnson was an old movie, about a mountain man." The man grinned again, and Dalton tried to discern how old he was. It was impossible in the dim light, but he had the impression the man was old, very old. "I'm no mountain man," Jeremiah laughed, shaking his head. Dalton sipped his water, savoring the precious commodity that he'd never appreciated until it was scarce. When he thought about all the thousands of gallons of water he'd wasted in his lifetime from stupid things like washing his truck or just running the faucet while brushing his teeth, it made him angry with himself. But how were we to know things would end up like this? If he were honest with himself, he knew how bad things would get. The Bible had laid it out. The end times would be incredibly difficult. People would fight just to survive. Mayhem, chaos, would be the norm. Surviving would be impossible unless you took the mark of the beast. But Dalton had been so sure that he'd never see those hard times. Jeremiah stared at him until he wanted to squirm. Despite the strange shadows from the candlelight dancing across his face, the man radiated no evil intent. In fact, he was oddly comforting, even when he was staring. Regardless, the intent Jeremiah paid to him was uncomfortable. "So," Dalton said, his voice cracking like a teen's. He cleared his throat, knowing it wouldn't do any good. The laryngitis would be with him for a while. "How?" Dalton paused, wondering how to ask what was on his mind without sounding rude. "How did you come across me?" he thought. "Were you just wandering around the desert at night looking for possible roamer victims?" Instead of asking the questions, he just shrugged and finished his second cup of water, already wanting more. Jeremiah lifted the pitcher and refilled his cup. "Thanks," Dalton croaked with a smile. At least he hoped he'd smiled. It seemed like it had been so long since he had done so, he wasn't sure he remembered how. There hadn't been much to be happy about for the past year or so. There was no mistaking Jeremiah's smile. "You want to know how I came across you in the desert in the middle of the night?" he said. Dalton smirked. "You a mind reader?" Jeremiah laughed as he shook his head. "No, but I'm a God listener, son." He pointed up. "He told me where to find you and that you needed help." Dalton's smirk turned to a grimace. "Wish I could believe that," he whispered. "Don't have much faith left. Or any at all." The older man nodded. "Pretty sure the Father knows that. Doesn't mean he no longer cares about you." Dalton couldn't help but snort at that. "Yeah, well..." His voice completely failed him then, as if his body didn't want him to finish his sentence. "Yeah, well, if God cares about me, he has a funny way of showing it. Look at my life. Look at how crappy everything is now. God, if he even exists, doesn't care about me, or about any of us." Jeremiah said, his face hardening. It wasn't an angry look, though. Dalton got the distinct impression he'd disappointed him, and for some reason that made his chest ache. The older man leaned forward. "An appalling and horrible thing bringing desolation and destruction has come to pass in the land. The prophets prophesy falsely, and the priests rule on their own authority, and my people love to have it so. But what will you do when the end comes?" Dalton frowned for a moment, trying to remember where he'd heard that. "Book of Jeremiah?" The Jeremiah in front of him smiled slightly. "Why is it you don't have any faith?" he asked, his teeth catching the candlelight in flashes of white. Dalton just shook his head. It wouldn't do any good to try to explain, not with his failing voice, or his failing ability to care to explain. "Do you doubt God's ability to take care of you in these terrible times?" Jeremiah pressed. It was painful, like pushing his finger into an open wound. "Or do you doubt that he wants to take care of you?" A sigh lifted Dalton's shoulders. He wasn't sure if he could explain how he felt, even if his voice would cooperate. There were just too many reasons why he no longer trusted in a deity he doubted even existed. "I doubt everything," he said silently to himself. "I doubt, if there really is a God, that he cares about me, about humanity. I doubt that there's any hope for any of us to survive this horrible time we've been tossed into. I doubt that there are any good people left." He shook his head at the last thought. So far, Jeremiah had proved that there were still kind-hearted people left in the world, but they were so rare they were practically non-existent. Mostly, Dalton thought, I doubt there's any hope at all. Jeremiah said again, as if he were truly reading Dalton's thoughts, despite his objections to the contrary. The man rubbed his jaw with his forefinger. Back before, he started, not having to explain what he meant. You remember seeing a tired-looking mama in the grocery store with a pack of kids, struggling to keep the young'uns from destroying the store. He said it as a statement, not a question, but Dalton nodded. Never failed that the youngest would want something, candy or some such, and the mama would understandably tell that child no. Maybe there wasn't money in the budget, or maybe she just didn't want the little darling to spoil his dinner or whatever. Well, you know what happened when the kid was told they couldn't have what they wanted. Jeremiah shook his head. Funny how when a kid is in public like that, they think they can get away with acting up, like they might not at home, crying, screaming, throwing themselves on the ground, just acting like a horse is behind. He stared intently at Dalton again. Sometimes adults act the same way when things don't go the way they wanted, he said quietly, though Dalton felt it deep within him, as if the words were somehow sliding into his ears, then sinking down into his psyche. Maybe they didn't get the spouse they wanted, or the house, the car, or their loved one died, despite all those prayers and begging God to spare them. Impossibly, Jeremiah's face seemed to lighten, to glow, and his gaze intensified. Or maybe, just maybe, they misunderstood something. Possibly got something wrong. And instead of trying to figure out what they missed or seeking the answer from the one who has it, they throw a fit and storm off. Dalton didn't have a response, though he knew exactly what Jeremiah was talking about. My lack of faith, turning away from God. The problem was, how did the man know? Again, the mind-reading question came to mind. But it's never too late to go back for that answer, son, he continued. Remember, God runs down the road to snatch up those wayward kids of his. A heavy sigh lifted Dalton's shoulders, and he rubbed his hand over his face. Yeah, he whispered, though he didn't really agree with the man. Or maybe he did. Confusion seemed to be clouding every thought he'd had lately. You're tired, Jeremiah said as he stood, then motioned to a dark back corner. There's a comfortable bed for you there. You sleep, and in the morning, I'll make you a hearty breakfast. Got to keep your strength up for the journey ahead of you. Dalton frowned at that comment. What was the man talking about? What journey? He briefly remembered having the thought before going to sleep that he might head south, to the unknown, unnamed island that was supposedly a sanctuary of some sort. But how in the world would Jeremiah know about that? Shaking his head, Dalton rasped out, I'm not going to take your bed. I can sleep on the floor. The hardwood floor was far better than the ashy sand he'd been sleeping on. Jeremiah laughed as he moved to the kitchen area, setting the water pitcher on the narrow counter. That won't do, boy. You take that bed. I'm fine. I don't need to sleep. And I insist, so don't argue. Dalton eyed the water pitcher as he stood and picked up his backpack. While Jeremiah had been nothing but kind, he still didn't trust him. Didn't trust anyone. The past year had been a harsh lesson in that. Jeremiah saw where he was looking. I'll leave that right there. You get as much as you want, and when you leave tomorrow, I'll fill up your water container. Dalton shook his head. He no longer had a water container. That had been stolen the last time he'd been jumped by the two outlaws. In fact, he couldn't remember the last time he'd even had water. Instead, he'd been drinking sodas or juice, whatever he could trade for. Water was too costly. Jeremiah smiled again. I've got a container you can take. How does he keep reading my mind? Dalton wondered. It was uncanny and unnerving. He wanted to leave, to head out into the dark desert, just to get away from the strange man who knew too much, who saw everything. But the bed beckoned. Another luxury he'd done without for far too long. The last time he'd slept in a bed had been the night before the congregation had turned on him. That night, just as the dozens of nights before, he'd lain in bed, listening to Becca crying softly while he pretended to sleep. Honestly, he preferred sleeping alone on the hard ground. After tucking his backpack under the bed, Dalton lowered himself to the mattress. He'd expected a hard cot, but was shocked when softness enveloped him. Almost as soon as his head hit the pillow, his eyes grew heavy. He blinked a few times, not willing to drift off, but couldn't seem to help himself. He thought he must have fallen asleep immediately because the last blink of his eyes revealed what had to be a dream. Jeremiah was glowing like he was on fire. Chapter 6. Unknown Paths. Charcoal gray. That was the only color to be seen. There was so much smoke in the air, even the fires still burning were shrouded in inky gray. Dalton plodded along, heading south. At least he hoped he was heading in the right direction. With the sun hidden thanks to the smog, it was nearly impossible to tell. He'd been surprised when Jeremiah told him that morning he was at the south end of Bryce Canyon, Utah. When Dalton had left Colorado Springs, he'd just started walking west with the thought that he might head to California and see if his mother and brother were still around, to find out if they'd welcome him or not. He hadn't spoken to them in years, not since he'd married Becca, and his family had been so against the marriage. Dalton had been a bit shocked at the level of antagonism they'd had toward his wife, for the simple reason that she'd been raised Jewish. Becca had converted to Christianity before he'd even met her, but that hadn't mattered to his mom and Ben. They were dead set on hating her, thanks to the anti-Semitic religion Dalton had been raised in. As long as he lived, which didn't appear to be much longer, he thought as he coughed, his lungs seizing and his ribs aching, he'd never forget the screaming argument they'd had while Becca cried outside on the patio. The Jews killed Jesus, his mother had argued. And Jesus was Jewish, he'd retorted. Neither Ben nor his mom had spoken to him again. Dalton didn't know when he'd changed direction and started heading to the southwest. If he'd continued on the path he'd been on, he likely would have ended up in Los Angeles, a far cry from his family in San Jose. Considering all the horror stories he'd heard about LA since the country had imploded, he was thankful he'd found a new direction of travel. Strangely, Jeremiah told him to head straight south until he came to the ocean, then to follow along the Mexican coastline. He hadn't given him further instruction after that, so Dalton wasn't sure where he was supposed to go or even where this supposed Paradise Island was, or if that was even where Jeremiah was sending him. His plodding steps became shuffles before long. He'd only been traveling for a few hours, but Dalton was tired. He wondered if his ongoing cough was an indication of something serious. He hoped so. It would mean the end for him much quicker. Having to suffer through all the stuff that was going on didn't sound like a great idea to him. The only problem was that he was no longer sure where he'd end up once he died. There was a time not long before, though it seemed like eons, when he'd been sure. At least that was the confident image he'd always projected to those he'd come across. Oh, those overly cheery sentiments that now made him cringe to remember. Absent from the body is present with the Lord. Where I'm going is better than where I've been. It's not dying. It's going home. He wished he could take back every single one of those idiotic things he'd said, write them on a sheet of paper, then light it on fire. A coughing fit gripped him then, and he moved to a partially burned log to sit. He'd learned the hard way, never to sit on the rocks. They were like natural ovens, sucking up all the heat in the atmosphere. And that was a lot of heat. Dalton figured the temperatures had to be in the hundreds. He pulled out the jug of water Jeremiah had given him and took a healthy sip. Though he still couldn't explain it, and Jeremiah just grinned when he'd asked why and how, the water was cool, just as it had been when the man had poured it from his pitcher. Another oddity attributed to the man in the desert. And there were plenty of them, those oddities. First, the way Jeremiah had found Dalton in the pitch-black night, saving him from who knew what. Then the cabin in the middle of a national park. Dalton knew before everything happened you couldn't just build a home on federal land, and that cabin wasn't a new structure. The cabin itself was strange, though it was just a typical wood frame structure. It was so cool inside you'd have sworn it was cooled by an air conditioner, which, of course, was impossible since electricity no longer existed for common man. Then there was the amazing breakfast Jeremiah had prepared for him that morning. Eggs, bacon, and even waffles with real maple syrup. Dalton couldn't even remember the last time he'd had any of those things. And the water... There was no explanation for the amazing water Jeremiah had. It was clean, pure, almost sweet tasting. It was the best water he'd ever had in his entire life, and that included the days when he'd had a top-of-the-line water filtration system. But the strangest thing about the water was it seemed to be perpetually cool, even in 100-plus degree heat. When his cough subsided, he held his breath as he took his scarf off, then splashed a few precious drops of the water onto the cloth before tying it back on. He sucked in as deep a breath as he dared, then blew out slowly when he didn't cough again. The moist air seemed to soothe his parched, tortured lungs. As near as he could tell by what little light there was, it was about midday. He'd been traveling since the sun had been just a slight glow on the horizon. By his estimation, he should be nearing the Arizona border. Never in his wildest dreams did he ever think he'd be walking to Mexico. Almost at the same time he'd decided to travel south, Dalton realized he didn't even have his passport, though he doubted those things mattered any longer. As far as he knew, the government was no more. Most countries' governments had dissolved, and from what he'd heard, chaos was the norm nearly everywhere. He wondered if the entire world was also inexplicably on fire. The idea of a paradise island had a heck of a lot of merit, imagining how nice it would be to live without looking over his shoulder, to sleep without worrying about what, or who, you might wake up to, To have food and water without having to fight for it, and to be able to breathe without sucking air through a dirty piece of cloth. Dalton pushed himself off the log, determined to continue on. Every day, every moment he could, he would push on, would continue on his journey to a new life. Chapter 7: Another Man's Treasure. The heat increased with every mile Dalton traveled south, or it seemed to anyway. He wondered if the temperature had increased everywhere on the entire Earth, while wondering why at the same time. While he knew Arizona had always been a hotspot for the United States, it was now either November or December, by his calculations. That meant even the hottest state in the U.S. should have cooled off. But it hadn't. Fires still burned. Smoke still hung in the air. The sun was still a fuzzy yellow-orange ball barely visible even in the middle of the day. The moon at night blood red when you could see it, but even then it was just a red shadow in the night sky. He figured he was somewhere near Flagstaff, which interestingly had been one of the snowiest cities in the U.S. before. Now, it was smoky, burning, and hot like everything else. Dalton sidestepped a fallen pine as he continued his parallel path to the highway in the near distance. He kept to the trees, those that were left standing, as much as possible. He'd learned his lesson the hard way to stay away from the road, though still kept it in sight so he didn't get lost. Surprise still filled him whenever a car would head down the highway. Dalton wondered if whoever was driving was very rich and had enough resources to trade for fuel, or else were very good thieves, and likely murderers, to commandeer such a vehicle and fuel. The latter was more likely. Trying to watch where he stepped, along with keeping an eye on the highway, he startled when he realized he'd come upon a house and darted behind a tree. Heart pounding, he waited a few moments, and when he didn't hear anything or anyone, he cautiously peered around the tree. The double-wide, mobile home looked like it had been long deserted. Dried weeds reached to the bottom of windows along the side, and a screen door hung crookedly on one hinge. The house was likely a victim of the economic depression that had hit the U.S. just before the global crash, leaving the owners to find housing elsewhere once they were evicted. But Dalton knew looks could be deceiving. One time he'd thought an office building was empty, only to find a group of roamers inside. Thankfully, they hadn't seen him, and he'd been able to sneak away before they attacked him. After that, Dalton was overly cautious when approaching buildings. He realized it might be a good thing that the world's temperature had shot up by dozens of degrees. Otherwise, his location would have been given away by the frosting of his breath in the cold air, especially since he was practically panting from the adrenaline rushing through him. Long moments went by while he stared at the house, trying to spy movement and listening carefully for any noise. When his legs started cramping from standing still, Dalton dashed to a tree nearer to the house, then to another. Still no indication anyone was inside. Sucking in a few breaths, as deeply as he could without coughing, Dalton left the shelter of the tree and moved to the back door. The crooked screen door screeched when he pulled it open. He winced and held still, waiting for the sounds of inhabitants running either for cover or for weapons. When no noise came from within, Dalton tried the doorknob and was surprised when it opened easily, which made him even more cautious as he peered in through the door into a kitchen. The home had been ransacked, likely by the former tenants. It had been the norm during the Depression. The attitude of, if you're going to kick me out, I'm taking everything I can with me. Appliances, window coverings, even plumbing pipes and electrical wire were often ripped from the foreclosures by those who no longer had the right to live there. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, including the floor. In the dim light, Dalton stared at the ugly vinyl flooring and relaxed when he saw there weren't any footprints in the dirt. The house really was abandoned. He released a relieved sigh as he lifted his heavy backpack off his shoulder and set it down behind the back door, out of sight, but ready to grab if he had to make a run for it. Stealing had become the norm in the age they found themselves in, but Dalton only took from the places he was sure had been abandoned. If an item was left behind, then it was up for grabs as far as he was concerned. The kitchen drawers were empty, which wasn't surprising, but it was still disappointing. A left-behind knife would have made his day. The cabinets and pantry as well had been cleaned out. There wasn't so much as a crumb left for a mouse. Another disappointment. Jeremiah had cooked that huge breakfast which had served to stuff Dalton's ever-empty belly, and had then provided a handful of jerky and a package of crackers. But that was all the food he now had. Until meeting the strange man in the desert, Dalton had been without anything at all for days. And other than a few worn-out clothes and his soul, he had nothing left to trade to get more. He left the empty kitchen and headed into the living room. It was a big space, enough room for a large family. Outlines of furniture still lined the walls, and Dalton could picture where the entertainment center would have sat, likely holding a big screen TV with a sectional sofa facing it from across the room. He imagined the laughter of children as they played on the living room rug. The sharp pang that hit him in the chest stole his breath, even though it happened every time he thought of kids. of families. Ariel would have been 7 this year. Forcing his thoughts away, Dalton left the empty room and moved into one of the bedrooms. The chest pain intensified when he saw the light yellow walls dotted with fairy tale characters. With a shaking hand, he closed the door and moved on. The next room was just as empty, though it looked like it had been used for storage at one time. He checked the closet, just in case, but the only thing in there was a pack rat nest in the corner. All that was left was the master bedroom. When he opened the door, he almost cheered when he saw it wasn't empty. Boxes lined one of the walls, and Dalton immediately moved toward them. They too were dusty and had obviously been sitting there for a very long time, and he wondered why they had been left behind. If the former tenants had accidentally forgotten them when they moved away. Excitement coursed through him as he opened the first box, but it was just books. He thumbed through a few paperbacks, not recognizing any titles, then winced when he saw a Bible. He quickly moved on to the next box: makeup, feminine products, and costume jewelry. Nothing he could use, so he moved on. A small box on top of a larger one had more bathroom items. He was thrilled to find an unopened bottle of hydrogen peroxide and some bandages, along with a bar of soap. He thought that if he ever came across enough water, he was going to use every sliver of that bar in one washing. Another box contained linens, sheets, blankets, and the like. Even though the temperatures were off the scale hot now, he still grabbed one of the blankets. It would come in handy when he had to sleep on the hard ground. The last and largest box contained a lifetime of knickknacks. Holiday decorations, a few more books, costume jewelry, and some scented candles that had long melted in the heat. It was the box that everyone had when they moved, the one where whatever was left that hadn't gotten packed got tossed into. He dug through the assortment of useless items to reach the bottom, pulling out the one thing he needed the most: a large wooden cross. A rare smile lifted the corners of his mouth as he studied the thing. The cross itself didn't make Dalton happy. He was still angry at God, all while questioning his existence. For the purpose of demonstrating faith, the cross was useless to him. But it would make a great weapon. It was heavy, had sharp edges, and could be swung like a hammer. Wrapped around the center slat was decorative barbed wire, which would also do some damage. He ignored the voice in his head telling him it was wrong to use a cross to beat someone. Chapter 8. Hiding in Plain Sight. After spending a few nights in the abandoned double-wide, Dalton continued on his journey. He was out of food, having eaten the last cracker and stick of jerky Jeremiah had given him the night before. But he still had water, which was the most important thing. He made sure to take tiny sips every hour to keep from succumbing to dehydration, though his dry mouth and chapped lips told him it likely wasn't enough. But he was terrified of running out of water again. Judging by the terrain, he was out of the cold weather area of Flagstaff, which was frankly laughable. If it snowed anywhere in the United States, or even dropped to below 100 degrees, he'd be surprised. Legs aching in exhaustion, a burned lump beckoned him. Dalton wasn't sure if it was a fallen tree or a cactus, but if it were the latter, he hoped the prickly needles had burned off. He tentatively sat, relieved when nothing stabbed his backside and thighs. He pulled his backpack off and dropped it at his feet. Even though he'd had 2 days of rest, he was already exhausted and wondered if his lack of stamina was due to the persistent cough that was always in the background, just waiting to show itself. The thought of it brought it out, and Dalton grunted, a half cough, half bark, as he tried to stifle it. Just doing so further exhausted him. "I'm dying," he whispered. The voicing of his fears for the first time seemed to give them purchase in his already damaged psyche. Though he'd always thought he'd die and be in heaven, now he was a bit fearful of just where he'd end up. But the thought of his possible demise was also freeing. If he was going to die soon, then he really had nothing to lose. Nothing to fear. Trying to survive the end times, as some had deemed the age they found themselves, would be trying, no doubt. But knowing that he was going to die regardless seemed to make the future less terrifying. It was a bit empowering. Dalton didn't rest too long. Despite his newfound confidence, or more accurately his lack of fear of what might come his way, he felt a great desire to move on, to keep traveling toward his destination, wherever that might be. Trudging along in the direction he hoped was south, he was forced to move farther from the road than he would have liked, into an area littered with huge boulders. But there wasn't any type of cover alongside the road, nothing to hide behind. He'd already spotted a band of roamers earlier that morning, prowling around the road like a pack of coyotes on a rabbit, so Dalton knew he had to take his chances of getting off course, if it meant not being spotted. Another concern about the highway was the startling sound of traffic. 3 times just that day, he'd heard the sounds of engines heading down the road. It had sounded like big trucks, semis like the one driven by the man who'd tried to rob him, and Dalton thought they might have been heading north, but it was hard to tell just by the sound. It was strange, he thought, that the sound of a vehicle was so odd. Before, traffic sounds were such a common feature in everyday life. No one ever thought twice about hearing the engines, tires squealing, honking. But with the U.S. turned into a third-world country, or worse, traveling in anything motorized was such an unattainable luxury that it was about like seeing a multi-million-dollar yacht trolling down the Mississippi River. Almost as if his thoughts had brought it into existence, he heard the distant sound of yet another engine. He paused beside a large boulder and tilted his head, listening. No, it's several, like a caravan or something. Curiosity won out over fear, and Dalton crawled up on the boulder. It was nearly impossible to see through the thick smoke, but he could make out the dim glow of headlights on the highway. Dozens of them. His heart rate kicked up as thoughts ran through his mind. Did the economy bounce back? Is there a way to buy things now? A new currency? Or did the government finally get their act together and step up to help folks out? If the answer to any of those questions was yes, it was worth the risk to find out. He shimmied back down the boulder and made his way out of the rocky terrain, his new destination to the west, where the highway was. He figured he'd flag down the first vehicle he saw and ask them what was going on. Excitement filled him for the first time as he walked as fast as he could over the uneven, sandy ground. If the economy was recovering, if things were going to start getting back to normal, or somewhat anyway, then he might have a chance to go home, to make amends with his family and friends. Maybe they wouldn't be so upset with him if it turned out that the financial crash wasn't the end of all things. Or the beginning of the end, anyway. Dalton thought he was just a few dozen yards away from the road when he spied movement to his right. Instinct made him squat and curl into a ball while trying to make himself as small as possible, hoping to not be spotted. Even though he'd just had thoughts of taking his chances and flagging down a stranger, there was still the very real danger of the roamers. "Did you see something over there?" a female voice called out from his right. It was so close, Dalton thought they might actually hear him breathing. "Don't cough. Don't cough," he begged his body to obey. Of course, as soon as he'd had the thought, he felt the tickle start. He squeezed his throat muscles, trying to clear it with just a tiny grunt. "See what? Where?" another voice answered to Dalton's left. "Great, I'm surrounded." "Don't know," the woman said. "Jack, bring that rifle over here. I want to use the scope." "'Kay, but don't waste ammo," yet another male said. Yeah, she retorted. "You're the one who wastes it with your lousy aim." "Hey!" the voice belonging to Jack whined. "That's not fair. It's not easy to hit a moving target, especially not with all this freaking smoke. Besides, I hit the guy." "In the leg," the other male said. "I had to shoot him in the head." "Whatever," Jack griped. Dalton heard a metallic clank and tightened his arms around his legs, for once thankful for the gloom. These people were obviously killers, and he hoped would look like another boulder. "Huh," the woman said. "Don't see it now. Weird." Dalton released a very slow, hissing breath into his knees as he thanked the terrible atmosphere for shielding him. The desire to find out what was going on with the world, of discovering why there were so many vehicles traveling now, fled him. "Come on," Jack said, his voice sounding fainter. Dalton assumed he was walking away. "We need to catch the next transport if we want to get to the Peacekeepers' base on time." "Peacekeepers' base?" Dalton wondered what they were talking about as he listened to their voices fading. Still, he didn't move, afraid that it was a trap, a ploy to get him to show himself. When his thighs started to burn and his back cramped, he released his grip on his legs and slowly unrolled his body, grimacing at the pain that shot through his limbs. He cautiously looked around, relieved to see he was alone. That thought was a bit amusing, he realized. He'd never been the loner type, instead preferring to be surrounded by family or friends at all times. But after having been forced from that familiar comfort, Dalton realized he'd become a big introvert. The fact that the majority of humans wanted to either kill him or harm him, or both, played a big part in that, of course. He stood, then succumbed to a fit of hacking. When it was over, ribs aching and stomach muscles twitching, it was all he could do to keep from collapsing back to the ground. With shaking legs as weak as a newborn fawn's, by sheer stubborn will he forced his body to move back toward the boulders. But when Dalton was just feet away from the relative shelter of the massive rocks, the dreary, gray world around him turned completely black. Chapter 9. Friendly Foes. It was dark. Murmuring nearby pricked at his consciousness, and Dalton forced his eyes to open. It was still dark. The voices were low, whispers in the night. He could only make out a word here and there, though he strained to hear. "Not for us to decide." "That's not what—" "It's a mess. I'm not going." So tell him to. Dalton tensed his hands, lifting them slightly just to test if he were restrained or not. The first time he'd been jumped by roamers, they'd tied him, then taunted him with talk of what they'd planned to do to him. Thankfully, his hands were free. He then tested his legs and they too were loose. He listened to the whispers for several minutes, trying to decide if they were planning his death or not, and how many there were. From what he could tell, it was just one man and one woman. But then a noise startled him. A dog? Dalton couldn't remember the last time he'd seen a dog. Thanks to desperation and starvation, most people had turned to their family pets. The new age they struggled to survive in had some pretty unimaginable horrors. Of course, he remembered the stories in the Bible depicting dire times when people had even eaten their own children. He'd never understood that level of desperation, not until everything fell apart. There was no mistaking the bark he'd heard, or the hissed, "Shy, keep that dog quiet," and the hushed reply, "Sorry." Dalton's eyes widened. It was a child who'd answered. He was sure of it. Another rarity in the present age. The year before, there had been a surge of young children dying. Most attributed it to the poor air, which back then had been much better than it was now. From the pulpit, Dalton had preached to grief-stricken parents, "Your children are with the Lord now. They're safe and happy. Jesus will take care of them until you can see them again." He doubted it offered much comfort. The sentiments sure hadn't helped him any when Ariel had died. Dalton blinked against the tears that filled his eyes. He was surprised he had enough fluid in his body to even make the things. Near dehydration had been the norm for so long he couldn't remember the last time his eyes hadn't felt dry. Even when he coughed, his nose didn't run and his eyes didn't moisten. "He's awake." The child spoke softly, but Dalton jumped at the nearness. He or she must have come close when he'd been remembering the things best left forgotten. He turned and squinted into the darkness and could make out the shape of the figure not 3 feet away. "Shy! Step away!" the man said in warning. Dalton saw another figure moving toward them, arm outstretched as he reached for the girl. He assumed it was a girl anyway, judging by the name. "He won't hurt us," the child said. "Billy likes him." Dalton wondered who Billy was, then jumped when something wet touched his hand before realizing it was the dog licking him. "Hey, Billy," he whispered as he blindly reached out, trying to pet the animal. His fingers brushed soft fur and Dalton almost laughed. It had been so long since he'd petted a dog he couldn't even recall the last time. Becca had been allergic to most dander, so they'd never had a pet, but he loved dogs and would often head to the local dog park just to watch the animals enjoying themselves and to pet a few. One lady jokingly called him the neighborhood pet perv. He pushed his fingers into the dog's fur and scratched while the dog wiggled his body. He was a big dog, and Dalton felt sorry for the creature with his long, thick fur. Poor thing must have been cooking in the heat. "You don't gotta whisper," the child said. "We're safe here." Dalton pushed himself up, groaning as he did so. His whole body hurt. He felt like he'd been run over by a truck. He stared at the dark silhouettes in front of him. "Can't talk," he croaked out barely above a whisper. "Laryngitis." "What's that?" the child asked. Dalton started to answer, but the man beat him to it. Just what he said. Means he can't talk. A cough tickled at his throat then, and Dalton put his face into his hoodie sleeve while he tried to stifle it. The silhouette's head turned his way. "That from the toads?" Dalton shook his head. "Toads? Like frogs?" "Nah," the man chuckled. "Toads, like nematodes, except they're something else. Parasites." He waved his arm. "It's from the smoke," the woman's voice said from behind the man. "The parasites are in the air." Dalton frowned, wondering what kind of crazies he'd stumbled upon. In fact, he was just starting to have enough sense to wonder how he'd gotten to be wherever it was he'd found himself. They weren't in a building, judging by the sand surrounding the blanket he was sitting on. He realized then it was the blanket he'd taken from the double-wide, and his frown deepened as he thought about the people going through his things. He remembered walking toward the boulders and then passing out? He put a hand to his head and felt for a bump, wondering if the strangers had smacked him over the head. But other than his greasy, unwashed hair, there wasn't anything unusual there. So if the unknown and unnamed people hadn't hit him, then why had he passed out? "They released the parasites," the man said, agreeing with the crazy statement the woman had made. "It's affected a bunch of people, but just those with Native American and Asian blood." Dalton shook his head. His mother had been half Sioux, which meant he was a quarter. But that didn't mean... "Have you been coughing a lot?" the woman asked. "Like you can't catch your breath and feel like you have a fever?" Dalton laughed to himself. Everyone felt like they had a fever now, with the 100-something temperatures. But instead of antagonizing the people who might actually be crazy, he murmured, "Yeah," though it came out barely more than a croak. No energy either? And really thirsty, she continued. Dalton rolled his eyes, though he knew that she couldn't see it. Everything she'd mentioned was something they likely all had experienced. Coughing, thanks to the ever-present smoke, which of course included being out of breath and no energy, which was expected when people were malnourished and dehydrated, which also explained the really thirsty comment. But it was the next question that made him suck in a breath. And did you ever have chemotherapy? He'd had chemo a few years back when his doctor had discovered a fast-growing skin cancer. Though he'd had surgery to remove it, they'd decided on chemotherapy as a precaution. Dalton nodded slowly. Yeah, he whispered. She made a noise he couldn't interpret. They've targeted people like you, she said. He got the impression she shrugged, though he couldn't really tell. Funny thing is, I bet you, and people like you, make up a good portion of the world's population. She stepped closer. Ever hear of the biblical end times when a third of the population are killed off? Dalton murmured his understanding, though he was reluctant to admit having any biblical knowledge. The woman cleared her throat. Sorry to tell you this, but I think you're one of them. Part of that third of the population. Chapter 10. Silver Linings. Cheryl's statement shocked Dalton, but he couldn't say he was upset by it. Not really. There was still a bit of fear, the what happens after death part, but something inside him, likely a leftover from his time as a Christian and pastor, told him he'd be okay. He tried to ignore that the reassurance came in the form of a still, small voice somewhere deep in his psyche. The little family had found him, mostly unconscious and somewhat delirious, near the boulders, just around the corner from the abandoned mine shaft they'd been occupying for months. It was actually the dog, Billy, who'd sniffed him out, and Cheyenne, the girl Dalton thought was named Shy, had brought her parents to him. Cheryl, who'd been a physician's assistant before, had determined he was severely dehydrated. Dalton hadn't been surprised. He couldn't remember the last time he'd remembered to take a sip of his water. Probably long before he'd seen the convoy on the highway. She'd griped at him for that, telling him he was an idiot for not drinking water when he had a full jug in his backpack. Dalton had been surprised to hear that and realized he must not have been drinking as much as he thought. His fear of running out and rationing had caused the same problem he'd been worrying about. Cheryl's husband Jerry watched Dalton with a keen eye, as if waiting for him to lose it at any moment and go on a rampage. It was funny, considering Jerry was a good half-foot taller than Dalton and probably outweighed him by 50 pounds. Cheyenne, however, had no fear whatsoever. Dalton had been shocked to find out the girl was 13. She was a tiny thing, and he'd thought she might have been 8 or 9, if that, but she was smart, funny, and outgoing. Dalton liked the kid, though he could have done without the non-stop talking. My hair is really red, she told him as he helped her gather sticks and logs that hadn't already burned completely. Jerry wanted to cook a rabbit Billy had managed to catch that morning, but Cheryl had balked at the idea of a fire, worrying it would alert roamers to their presence. Both Jerry and Dalton had laughed, though it had caused another coughing fit. Fires are burning everywhere, Dalton had assured the woman once he'd caught his breath. One more isn't going to be noticed. She'd finally relented, most likely due to the fact that she wanted fresh meat as much as the rest of them. Oh yeah? Dalton murmured to the girl. Just to not be rude, he couldn't care less what color her hair was. At the moment, it was a dull gray like the rest of the world. Despite her father's watchful eye, he didn't seem to have a problem with Dalton going off to find firewood with his daughter. Dalton figured that was due to Billy's presence. The dog watched the girl even more closely than her father did. Yep, Cheyenne said with a pop, as she picked up a small stick and tucked it into the sack strapped to Billy's back. She insisted the dog wanted to help and that he was happiest when working. Judging by the way the big collie cross wagged his tail whenever she added a stick to his bag, maybe she was right. I wish you'd let me put that mask on you, she scolded the dog as she patted his head. The air is bad for you too, you know. But then, I guess you wouldn't be able to catch rabbits, huh? Billy responded by giving her hand a lick. Once the sun had come up and they'd ventured outside of the mine, Dalton had been surprised to see how healthy the little family looked. Even Billy had the look of being well cared for, though his coat was dingy thanks to being dirty. But all 4 of them were well fed, at least in comparison to everyone else Dalton had encountered. Everyone but Jeremiah, he thought to himself. That man looked like he hadn't suffered at all from the effects of the environment, dehydration, and starvation that plagued the rest of humanity. It was strange. And so was that glowing thing, he thought. Nanette! Dalton shook his thoughts away as he picked through the remains of a burned-out tree. Most of it had been reduced to nothing more than charcoal, but he managed to pull out a few usable branches, and he'd been a bit discouraged to find out he wasn't as far south as he'd thought, which explained why there was still an abundance of trees, though most were on the ground. Jerry explained they were near Prescott. though the man made sure to tell him it was pronounced Prescott, like it mattered anymore. Born and raised here, he'd said. Both me and Cheryl. That's why we knew about this mine. Used to play here when we were kids. Dalton thought it was kind of enviable to have a hole in the ground to hide in. There was the obvious perk of hiding away from those who sought to hurt you, but there was the additional features of better air and cooler temperatures, both huge pluses. Grandma Lil always said my hair was as red as fire. Cheyenne's voice trailed off, and Dalton glanced her way. Her expression seemed pinched, though it was difficult to tell through the face covering she wore. She's dead, she sighed. Her and Grandpa died right after, you know. She waved her hand and he nodded. Yeah, I know all too well. Guess I can't look in the rearview mirror, she continued. Despite the morbidity of the conversation, Dalton chuckled at the expression. He doubted the girl even knew what a rearview mirror was. Gotta look forward. Keep on swimming. She muttered the words almost to herself, and they sounded almost like a chant, a self-pep talk. He murmured in agreement, though he didn't trust his voice to speak. Since Cheryl insisted he keep drinking, the cough had gotten better, but the laryngitis was still present. His input wasn't necessary, though. Cheyenne seemed to be perfectly capable of carrying on a conversation all by herself. The girl clutched her bundle of larger sticks to her chest as she picked up kindling to tuck into Billy's pack. I'm sure looking forward to that rabbit, she said, though Dalton thought she might be talking to the dog. Her next words confirmed it. You were such a good boy to catch that for us, she cooed as she scratched the dog behind his ears with her filthy hands. Dalton glanced at his own, wincing to see that they were nearly as dark as the charred wood he carried. He would have plucked out his eye and handed it over for a long, hot shower with extra soap and shampoo. We were all getting tired of those MREs Daddy traded his truck for, Cheyenne went on, talking to the dog. Dalton wondered if she did that often. But thanks to you, we get something better tonight. He couldn't tell, but Dalton had the impression she was grinning at Billy. And I'll make sure you get all the bones. She shook her head. Well, all except the ones Mama will want for soup. Sure hope she don't make that cactus one. Gross, she grumbled with a dramatic shiver that made the branches she held rattle. But buggers can't be choosers. Dalton huffed a silent laugh at the wrong wording, though he didn't correct the girl. She turned and walked toward a large group of boulders, still rambling on. He followed, just because he didn't want to let Cheyenne get out of his sight. He felt a strange compulsion to watch over her. It was after midday, but the light was dim. Nothing unusual, but for some reason it felt more oppressive than normal. The thought made Dalton laugh. In his experience, everything about the past year or so was oppressive, depressing, and discouraging as well. The hairs on the back of his neck pricked up and he tensed, looking around. But nothing was out of the ordinary. Still, it felt like something was wrong. Hey, Cheyenne, he said, though it came out barely a whisper. I think we... A low growl interrupted him, and he looked at Billy, who had his back fur up, ears forward, and teeth bared as he stared beyond Cheyenne toward the north. Come back here, Dalton ordered in his raspy whisper, hand extended as if he could grasp the girl who was a handful of yards ahead of him, but she was oblivious as she plunged ahead, talking to no one in particular. Cheyenne! That time, his voice cooperated, and the order came out in a bark, just as Billy, too, let loose with his own woof. But the warning came too late. Chapter 11. The Things We Leave Behind. Chalking it up to intuition, Dalton wasn't surprised to see that a man had grabbed Cheyenne, sliding his dirty hand under the scarf she wore to cover her mouth as he pulled her to his chest. His other hand held a gun that he pressed flat against her stomach, pulling her fully into his body while she dropped the bundle of the sticks. The girl's wide, terrified eyes pleaded with Dalton for help. He wasn't surprised by the man's appearance, but he was infuriated. Let her go, he said as he dropped his own arm load, again shocked that his voice worked as it should. In fact, it was lower than normal, almost vibratory, and he fought against the urge to clear his throat. Please don't start coughing, he thought. Not now. Billy didn't stop growling, but the dog inexplicably seemed to be weighing the consequences of leaping at the stranger gripping his mistress. Dalton hoped the dog didn't react, hoped that he'd stay where he was, 10 feet away. There was no telling what would happen if the dog went after the man. Yeah, not gonna happen, the man growled. Me and your daughter are gonna head to the Peacekeeper's base. He grinned at Dalton over Cheyenne's head, and it wasn't until that moment he realized the man wasn't wearing a covering over his mouth and nose. They're paying 5 big ones for girls like this. Dalton didn't want to know why the Peacekeepers would pay for a young girl, though he did want to know what big ones were. Before, it usually meant $100 bills. Again, he wondered if things had changed, if the economy had miraculously recovered somehow. But none of that mattered in the moment. Look, man, Dalton held up his hands, still surprised at the strength of his voice. You aren't going to get away. He nodded toward Billy. This dog here is going to rip your throat out before you get 10 feet away. Best just leave now, without the girl." The man's eyes flickered toward the dog, and Dalton caught the flash of apprehension there. But greed seemed to win out, and he tightened his grip on Cheyenne as he took another step back. She whimpered, and Billy gave a warning bark. "Easy, boy," Dalton murmured, not taking his eyes off the man. "Neither one of us are going to let you just take her," he said reasonably with a nod toward Billy. "It's best you let her go and be on your way." No matter how many times he repeated it, he could see the words weren't sinking in. The man thought he had the upper hand as he continued grinning and backing away. Dalton glanced behind the man and noticed a rock a few feet away. If he kept to the path he was on, he'd fall right over it. Dalton was glad he had a scarf over his own face to hide his grin. He stepped forward, Billy following suit. "You're not going to get away," he repeated while the dog snarled. The man pulled his hand away from Cheyenne's midsection to point the gun at Billy. "How about I just shoot the dog and you?" he said with another grin. Dalton noticed then the man's teeth were nearly as black as his dirty hands. "Then I won't have to deal with either of you." Dalton hoped it was just a threat as he took another step forward. Thankfully, the man stepped back. Almost there. The man's eyes narrowed as he turned the gun on Dalton. "Stop right there," he warned. But Dalton ignored it and took 2 steps forward. The man startled and took a big step back, hitting the rock with the back of his leg, losing his balance. Dalton didn't waste any time. He turned back and snatched up the biggest branch he'd had, then ran forward and swung it like a golf club. Before, he'd been a pretty good golfer, but no hole-in-one was as satisfying as seeing the gun fly off into the dusky distance, with a clatter as it hit a rock. Cheyenne scrambled away from the man, getting quickly out of reach. Billy wasted no time before he was on the guy, snapping and snarling. The man screamed and tried to fight the dog off, but he was no match for the sharp teeth. Dalton stood in shock for a moment. He'd always thought collies were docile, family-type dogs, the lassies of the dog world who protected the Timmies. But Billy looked more like a rabid feral dog. "Get him off me!" the man screamed as Cheryl and Jerry ran up. They stared at the man, then back at Dalton as Cheyenne seemed to come to herself and ran for her mother. "He grabbed Cheyenne," Dalton said. He was going to sell me," Cheyenne stuttered as her mother held her tightly. Jerry cursed, then yelled at Billy to stand down. Surprisingly, the dog obeyed, though he still snarled and snapped at the man while backing off. The guy moaned as he sat up. Dalton expected to see blood and gore, but there was only a cut on his cheek. Of course, he could have had more injuries, but it was difficult to tell through all the ash and dirt. He pushed himself to his feet, stumbling and almost falling again. Once upright, he kept a wary eye on the dog as he pointed at Dalton. "You ain't seen the last of me," he threatened. Dalton couldn't help rolling his eyes. "You watched too many spaghetti westerns before," he chuckled. "This town ain't big enough for the two of us," Jerry drawled, with a thick southern accent and a laugh. "Seriously." The man's eyes had narrowed on Dalton at his comment, but then darted to Jerry after his joke. "Jerry? Jerry Coldwell?" Dalton heard the father suck in a breath beside him. "Lon?" he asked in question as he slid an arm around Cheryl, who still held a trembling Cheyenne. The creep nodded and clutched his arm, making Dalton think he was right about unseen injuries. "You're going to pay for this," he told Jerry as his eyes slid back to Dalton. "Guess I was wrong about who the daddy was. Don't know who you are, but you better watch your back." "Oh, please," Dalton said, thankful his voice still held out. "You're the one who started this, and the dog is the one who finished it." That comment drew Lon's attention back to Billy, who growled again. With one last threatening look, Lon turned and stumbled off into the gloom. They watched after him for a moment, then Dalton turned to Jerry. "Friend of yours?" Jerry shook his head. "Old enemy, actually. Lon's had it out for me ever since I put a mechanic's lien on his truck when he refused to pay his bill. That was over 10 years ago, but I guess he's still hanging on to that grudge." Dalton shook his head. "Well, regardless, you should probably move on," he suggested. "Leave the area. No telling what that psycho is going to do." "Nah," Jerry shrugged. "The mine shaft is hidden, especially now," he added with a wave to indicate the dim light as he looked heavenward. "And this happened pretty far from the mine. We got to be a good 1/8 mile away. That's why it took us so long to find you." Dalton frowned at that. He was usually pretty good at paying attention to his surroundings and where he was headed, especially after the encounters with the roamers. He must have been distracted by Cheyenne's constant chatter. That thought made him glance at the girl. He caught Cheryl's eye. "She okay?" The woman nodded. "Yeah, she's fine." She pushed Cheyenne away, though she held onto her arms. "You're okay, aren't you, sweetie?" The girl sniffled and nodded, then wiped her eyes with her scarf. All that served to do was smear the ash, making dark circles around her eyes. "You look like a raccoon," Jerry laughed as he pulled the girl into a hug. "I do not," Cheyenne protested. "Do too." her mother laughed. The trio turned and started walking back toward the mine, and Dalton followed, but with hesitation. He wasn't serving any purpose in staying, he thought, as they made their way through the murkiness of the day, and if that lawn creep made good on his word, it would be better if Dalton wasn't around. One less body to be spotted, less chance of the Coldwells being found. Though he'd been looking forward to the rabbit meal, he decided he'd better leave as soon as possible. But ignoring the ache in his chest at the thought of leaving wasn't easy. Chapter 12. The Gloom and Doom. 9 days had passed since Dalton left the Coldwells, but it felt like just yesterday with the ache that still squeezed his chest. He told himself he didn't know why it pained him so much to walk away, but he knew that was a lie. He knew exactly why it hurt so much. In just a few days, the little family had felt like family. It had been so long since he'd had that, the camaraderie, the happy, warm moments coupled with the deeper, more intimate discussions that seemed to rip out the ugly parts in his soul. He hadn't shared all of his story, but he did tell them about Ariel, how his sweet angel had succumbed to leukemia, and how his wife had faded into a sepia version of her vibrant self right before his eyes. How she'd seemed to blame him, as if he'd had the answers and the solutions to an invisible illness that stole their little girl right out of their arms. What he hadn't shared was that he'd been a pastor for nearly 20 years. He knew that bit of information would dredge up too much pain, and more questions he didn't have the answers to. His former faith was something he'd rather not think about. Dalton had no idea if the Coldwells were believers themselves. The subject hadn't come up. But they'd shown more care and kindness to him, a stranger, than he'd gotten from his own congregation once they'd determined to blame him for preaching the wrong information. He'd practically begged the Coldwells to come with him, but they'd wanted to stay. Jerry was understandably fearful of traveling with the females. When Dalton had insisted he had to leave, Cheyenne had clung to him like he was a favorite uncle. Cheryl had actually gotten teary-eyed, and Jerry kept trying to talk him out of it. But when Dalton had been adamant about leaving, the little family had given him food and even extra clothes out of their meager possessions. Just before he walked away, Cheyenne pressed something into his hand. Dalton had been surprised to see a piece of hair ribbon, much like the one he carried in his pocket. Her eyes were full of tears as she stared up at him. "To remember me," she'd said, pointing at the dirty orange-red ribbon. "Same color as my hair," she'd laughed. Impulsively and completely out of character, at least for the past year or more, Dalton had hugged her, fighting his own tears. Cheyenne didn't have any idea about Ariel's ribbon in his pocket and couldn't have known how much the little scrap of fabric would mean to him. He'd placed it in his pocket next to Ariel's. Dalton was so lost in his thoughts that he was brought up short when he heard voices. He hadn't seen or heard any sign of civilization in days, not since he'd entered the Organ Pipe National Park. He'd only known where he was thanks to a sign that had fallen over that he'd used to sleep on. He knew he was close to Mexico and still had the problem of somehow getting through the border wall. Not knowing what he was facing until he got there, he'd put it out of his mind as he plodded along on his southerly path. The voices were far enough away to be indistinguishable, but he still found a hiding place behind yet another cactus, and listened carefully. He couldn't make out what was being said, but there was no mistaking an argument taking place. The voices grew louder until he could make out a few words, but the sound of a gunshot brought an end to the argument. Dalton's heart raced while he considered all the possibilities. It could have been roamers attacking someone, or the peacekeepers he'd heard about who seemed to be just the opposite. It could just be others like him, trying to get out of the U.S. and had something go terribly wrong. Regardless, he didn't want to take the chance of being seen. He squatted behind the cactus and peered out, but he couldn't see anything. It was getting late in the day, which meant more gloom than usual, but he couldn't even make out lights of any kind. The voices, too, had stopped. There was another cactus ahead, and he darted to it. If it was too dark for him to see the others, he hoped the same was true for them. He paused when a cough threatened, but managed to hold it back as his eyes filled from the effort. He waited for another few moments, and then moved to another cactus, then to a boulder. Dalton realized he was now close enough to see the people he'd heard, but what caught his attention, and caused no small amount of worry, was the huge fence behind them. Before, he'd heard all the discussion of the new border wall being built, but he had no idea it was so high. There was no way he'd be able to climb it, which was obviously the intention when it had been designed. And he wondered how in the world he was going to get into Mexico. The irony of the situation didn't escape him, but the humor of it didn't do anything to solve the problem. He squinted into the grayness, trying to assess the situation, but he still couldn't tell what was going on. There were several figures moving about, going from a vehicle to the border fence several times, crouching down in front of the massive structure each time. Dalton frowned, wondering what they were doing. It was a few moments later when he heard one of them yell, "Move back!" Dalton squinted harder to see what they were doing and was shocked when a loud boom pierced the air, followed by a cloud he could see even through the gloom. He blinked a few times, trying to discern what had just happened. It took several moments for the cloud to clear enough to see that the people who'd been in front of the wall were scrambling around gathering things, then jumping into their vehicle. He heard an engine start, then watched with wide eyes as the truck drove through to the Mexican side. They blew a hole in the border wall, he thought. Nada! Dalton straightened and stepped out from his hiding place to get a better look. Besides the thick air, there was also a cloud of dust hovering from the explosion, but he could still see the gap in the steel structure that was large enough to drive a semi through. He huffed out a laugh. Well, guess that solves my problem of how to get over the border, he murmured to himself. Since it was approaching nighttime, he decided to stay where he was until early morning, when he'd head into Mexico. Hopefully he'd reach the ocean within a few days. Dalton smoothed out the ground next to the cactus, moving the larger rocks aside. It was another oddity, he thought, how he could sleep on the hard, sandy ground when before he'd had to have the best memory foam mattress he could afford thanks to his bad back. With all the other troubles he faced on a daily basis, he honestly couldn't remember the last time his back had pained him. A little discomfort paled in comparison to starvation. Before settling down, he pulled out his water jug and took a healthy sip. After nearly dying from dehydration, he was careful to keep his water intake up. The water, as always, was cool. Dalton ignored the fact that the jug hadn't run out yet, despite having had it for nearly 3 weeks with no refills. And he was trying really, really hard to not think about that. Chapter 13. Something Wicked. This Way Comes. The sun hadn't risen yet as far as Dalton could tell. He yawned and stretched, wincing as his spine snapped and creaked like a corpse rising from the grave. That thought brought to mind the last scripture he'd taught on before. Well, before. The tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep in death were raised to life. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many people. He shook the thoughts and memories away. It aggravated him how much the scripture he recalled. Passages he'd never put any effort into memorizing seemed to have stuck in his brain with unnerving clarity. Useless. Scripture wasn't going to keep him alive. It wasn't going to get him where he was going. And it sure wasn't going to help him find the danged place. And God, well, Dalton figured since he didn't seem to have any use for him, the feeling was mutual. His thoughts and emotions were as dark as the sky and earth, while he packed up his few belongings, took a sip from the cool water jug and pushed himself up. He wanted to get through the new hole in the border wall before daylight. As he neared the border, he noticed a pile of metal debris on the ground. Dalton considered picking through the mess to look for a better weapon than his wooden cross currently sticking out of his pack, but all the spikes were too long. He carefully climbed over the pile. The last thing he needed was an injury with no way to treat it. One lone bottle of peroxide and a few bandages weren't going to do much for him if he ripped his leg open. As his thoughts turned in that direction, Dalton sighed. After spending so much time in doctors' offices and the hospital with Ariel, the last thing he and Becca had wanted to do was go to the doctor themselves. He couldn't even remember the last time he'd seen one. He had considered it when the cough started, back when the fires had just started burning. And now the cough was so much worse. I should have gotten it checked out, he thought to himself. Should have taken care of it when I had the chance. He huffed out a laugh. Quit shooting on yourself, he muttered as he stumbled down from the bits of twisted steel and moved toward the hole. He stopped to examine the structure, since there were still jagged pieces above him that seemed to be hanging a bit precariously. If there had been the slightest breeze, Dalton imagined they'd clang together like a wind chime. He paused at the opening, watching the swaying metal, imagining a chunk coming loose and impaling him. Swallowing hard, he reminded himself that dying had to be better than barely existing in the age he found himself, and had to ignore that nagging voice in his head telling him that he didn't know where he'd end up if he did die. It was funny how that voice was a lot louder than the other, more encouraging voice. Steeling himself and laughing when he thought about the fact he didn't want to literally steal himself as he glanced up again, he took the 4 steps necessary to cross the border. Well, that was easy, he mumbled. He'd never been to Mexico, but knew crossing the border usually was a lot more involved. There was something to be said for not doing it legally. Guess that answers the question of why people hopped the fence before, he muttered. And quit talking to yourself. You sound insane. He then wondered if he truly was insane since he was talking to himself in the third person, even if it was silently. Shaking his thoughts away, he started walking, changing his direction to a more westerly one. According to what he remembered of Mexico's geography, The ocean wasn't too far from where he was. If he were driving, it would be just a few hours away. Walking, well, another couple days. For some stupid reason, Dalton thought the atmosphere would be better in Mexico. The air fresher, the fires less. But nothing had changed. Of course, he reminded himself that he was just a few dozen yards inside the country. He picked his way around in the gloom, mostly avoiding the obstacles that seemed to want to trip him. Rocks, cacti, little sand mounds. Though he knew Mexico had a variety of topography, even mountains that saw snow, where he found himself seemed typical of every show, every cartoon he'd ever seen. Sand, rocks, cacti. The only difference was that instead of the boring beige sand and rocks, everything was the new norm of ash gray. Just as boring to look at, but far worse in so many ways. Dalton had been trudging along for about 20 minutes when a sound made his heart lurch. "Alto! Stop!" That was followed by some more words he didn't understand, but by instinct he put his hands up in a non-threatening way. The voice had come from behind him and he cursed himself for not paying better attention to his surroundings. Once again his inattention caused him to be spotted. "If I get out of this one," he thought to himself, "I swear I'm going to quit thinking so much and start listening." "Turn around," the man said in accented English. Dalton slowly turned, squinting as he tried to make out the figure who came into view. There were 3 of them, he realized, as his heart sped up even further. "Do you want to explain why you broke the border?" the man in front asked in a demanding voice. Dalton frowned at the question. Did the man mean why did he cross the border illegally? "I just wanted to get to South America," he said as he started to turn and unnecessarily waved to the south. The man lifted his hand and Dalton saw he had what looked like a pistol, though it was hard to tell. He put his hands up higher. "So you thought you would just make a way for yourself?" the man said. Though Dalton couldn't see his face, he knew he was sneering. He considered the question and how to answer it. If the man was trying to get him to admit to crossing illegally, that was certainly unnecessary. He was far from any actual crossing. Look, I don't mean any harm." The soldier interrupted him. "You didn't mean harm when you blew a hole in the fence?" Dalton's eyes widened as he shook his head. "I didn't do that," he protested. His arms were getting tired from keeping his hands raised and he started to lower them, but the man lifted the gun higher in a threatening manner. Dalton put his hands back up. "There was a truck and some men last night," he said as he nodded toward the massive fence in the distance. It was so large he could still make it out. "They blew the hole, not me." One of the people behind the man with the gun stepped up. Dalton saw that he held a rifle, trained on him. "I don't see no peoples now," he said, his English not as good as the first man. "Just you." Dalton gave a little head shake again. "I didn't do it," he repeated. "I wouldn't even know how to use explosives." I'm a pastor," he said, the words bitter on his tongue. He didn't know if that was because they were now a lie, or if it was the admission itself that caused it. The trio of men chuckled. "You don't look like a padre," the second man said. Dalton winced. With his filthy clothing, worn-out hoodie and ratty scarf over his face, he didn't look like a priest, and he didn't look like a pastor either, for that matter. If they could see in his mind, in his heart, they'd know he was lying. A man of God didn't deny God's very existence. "You got some proof of what you say?" The question made Dalton pause. No, he didn't. He had thrown away his clergy ID on his way out of Colorado Springs. Still, he slowly lowered his hands and carefully pulled his backpack off, then squatted to rummage through it. He kept his movements slow and methodical. He started to unzip the pack so he could pull out his wallet. Why he still kept the thing was a good question. It was full of credit cards that were useless, along with cash that was only good for lighting yet more fires. His driver's license was certainly unnecessary as well. Before he could open the pack, he saw the cross sticking out of the top. He thought about how he'd planned to use it as a weapon and felt a twinge of guilt before pulling it out, hoping it would help make his case. The man closest to him stepped up and peered at what he was doing. Dalton had a moment of fantasy where he imagined beating the guy over the head with it, then tackling the other 2. But no matter how fast he might move, he'd never move faster than a bullet. Chapter 14. Saving Grace. The thoughts of death entered his head again. If what Cheryl had said was true, about the parasites in the smoke killing people like him, then he was a dead man walking already. Besides, who really wanted to live with how things were now? But he'd also started having thoughts of this supposed island paradise, of living out whatever time he had left breathing fresh sea air, of swimming in the cool ocean waters and eating seafood. It seemed like a good way to go. Instead of attacking the men, he pulled the cross slowly out and lifted it up. It wasn't exactly a clergy ID, but he figured the men would assume only a pastor would be lugging such a thing around. "So you are a pastor," the man said as Dalton stood and dropped the cross to his side. He was frankly surprised the guy had fallen for it. "Yeah," Dalton murmured, not liking the taste of the lie. "And what does this prove?" the man asked. He was close enough that Dalton could see the sneer on his dark face. It occurred to him then that the man was not only not wearing a scarf, but he wasn't dirty. The others had drawn near, and he could see that they too were maskless and clean. He wondered how the men were able to bathe with the water shortage, and had a very sharp pang of envy. "You are a pastor, as you say," he continued, motioning to the cross Dalton still clutched. The thing was heavy, but that does not mean you could not have blown the hole. He turned and waved toward the fence in the distance. Dalton stared at the fence, then looked back at the man who seemed to be in charge. "Why do you care?" he asked. "I mean, the wall was built by the USA. I thought the Mexicans opposed it." His words were probably inflammatory, but Dalton was starting to realize that the men weren't going to let him go anyway. He was likely going to die right there, just inside the Mexican border, and no one he knew would ever know, or care. The men stiffened. "You think we are Mexicans?" the presumed leader asked, his sneer growing until the corner of his upper lip nearly touched his nose. The man snorted. "We're Venezuelans," the third man, who hadn't yet spoken, offered. Dalton noticed he was holding another rifle, loosely hugging it in front of him. They obviously weren't worried about him or thought him to be a threat. "But we were hired by the Mexico peacekeepers to keep the peace," the first man said, glancing at his friends. They all laughed. Dalton frowned, wondering at their inside joke, but figured it was likely due to the last part of his comment. Jerry had said the peacekeepers were governmental thugs, not much different than the pirates of old. They were well-armed criminals, given the blessing of the government to do whatever they wanted to keep the peace. And apparently they weren't just in the U.S. He considered his options. There weren't many. Take his chance on running, knowing he wouldn't get far before they shot him in the back. Or fight back? 3 against 1 was never a good odd, especially when he was only armed with a piece of wood. Or just wait and see what happened. It was the one thing Jerry had warned him about just before he left. Don't let the peacekeepers get you. He'd said the group were known for their torture methods, for their Nazi-style experiments. Once you're in a peacekeeper compound, Jerry had warned, you can bet you'll never get out again. Dalton decided he'd wait for the perfect opportunity to go on the offensive. Running away was probably a better option, but he figured he'd start coughing and wouldn't get more than a few yards anyway. It seemed like a better idea to at least take a few of the enemy out. He doubted he'd be able to kill them with the cross, but he could at least do some real damage. "Enough speaking," the first man said as he put his hand out and motioned for Dalton to go with them. He bent to pick up his pack. "You will not need that where you are going," the second man snickered as he grabbed his arm and shoved him in front of him, sandwiching Dalton in between them. His hand tightened on the cross, thinking he was going to be the first one he bashed in the skull. Dalton shrugged. "Yeah, well, I don't want to leave it out here for the..." His voice trailed off. "For the... what? Wildlife? There wasn't any. For others to find? Why not? His belongings could help someone else, at least the water jug could." That thought made his throat start to itch again, and he pulled out his jug. Lifting his scarf, he took a long drink of the cool water while they walked back toward the fence. Dalton frowned when he saw the outline of a vehicle that looked somewhat like a Jeep parked near the hole. Did they drive through from the U.S.? He tucked the jug back in his pack and repositioned the cross in his dominant left hand, waiting for his opportunity. It would likely come when the men were getting in the vehicle. Then they'd have to take their attention off him and wouldn't be aiming their weapons his way either. He'd watch and wait, and swing as hard as he could when the timing felt right. They were about 20 feet away from the vehicle when the leader stopped short. Dalton almost plowed into him. "What is..." one of the men behind him started to ask, his voice trailing off. "Dios mío," the other breathed. Dalton frowned and leaned to peer around the leader. He didn't really expect to see anything, not with the thick air, but he blinked several times at the sight before him. Leaning casually against the hood of the Jeep, arms crossed over his chest and legs crossed at the ankles, stood a huge man. While that was strange in and of itself, what was even more odd was the fact that he was on fire. "No, not on fire," Dalton corrected himself as he shook his head, then rubbed his eyes with the thumb and forefinger of his free hand. "He's glowing." But what was even crazier, as if that wasn't enough, he recognized the glowing man. "Jeremiah," he whispered. The leader glanced back at him, a question on his shocked face. Dalton ignored him. The glowing man straightened and started walking toward them. The light from his body ebbed and flowed like undulating waves of lava with each movement. It was odd, yet beautiful at the same time. "Dalton, come here," Jeremiah said as he put his hand out. Dalton felt a weird compulsion to do as he asked and made to step around the leader, but one of the men behind him grabbed his arm. "This is our prisoner," he said. The words seemed to snap the leader into action because he spun around and put his pistol to Dalton's head. "Yes, he is," he said as he moved to Dalton's side. "I do not know what this trick is," he added, motioning toward Jeremiah with his free hand, "but you are not taking this man. He is coming with us to the Peacekeeper's base." Jeremiah grinned, his teeth impossibly white through all the radiance surrounding him. "No, you're not taking him anywhere. He's not up for grabs. Remove your hands and your weapon from him, or else Dalton's going to release the Lord's vengeance on you three." "Huh?" Dalton blinked at Jeremiah's words. "I'm going to release the Lord's vengeance? How in the world was he going to do that?" But almost as soon as he'd asked himself that question, another bright light caught his eye, and he glanced down to the forgotten cross in his hand. It, too, was shining, and even more brightly than Jeremiah. An impossibility, since it was made of wood, yet it wasn't on fire. Dalton lifted it up, eyes wide as he stared at the object. Though it should have been, it wasn't hot, but it was strangely vibrating, as if it had a life of its own. He held it away from his body. The leader laughed. "Are we supposed to be afraid of that?" He pointed to the glowing cross with his free hand. "My daughter had such a thing. A lightsaber, she called it. I do not think we need to worry about a child's toy." He laughed again, and the others followed, though their laughter sounded more forced and less sure. Jeremiah crossed his arms and shrugged. Dalton stared at him. When he'd helped him in the desert, the man had been an average size, about the same as Dalton. But now, he was massive, tall, broad, muscles on muscles. No amount of steroids or working out in such a short time could have done such a thing. He shoved the thoughts away that threatened to consume him, all the questions lingering in his mind as to who, or what, Jeremiah actually was. "If you want to take your chances, that's up to you," the glowing man said. "But know that you're not taking Dalton anywhere, and if you try, you will die." That brought more laughter from the leader. "Neither one of you are armed," he said. "My friends and I are very well armed, and we can call for more soldiers who will be here in minutes," he boasted. "What do you think 2 unarmed men are going to do against 3 with weapons?" Jeremiah grinned again. "I'm not going to do anything. Dalton is going to do it all. It's his right, considering the thoughts you had for harm against him." His face got hard. "The Lord knows all the thoughts, and you have been judged for yours." The cross started vibrating again, and Dalton had another compulsion, this time to wield it. Without thinking, he swung it back, catching the leader right in the face, knocking him back several feet where he collapsed on his back. Time seemed to slow then, as he watched the gun he'd held to Dalton's temple hit the dirt with a puff of dust and ash. There was no hesitation as he spun and struck the man to his right. The cross caught him in the temple, and he, too, crumpled, his rifle falling to his side. The momentum of that swing carried Dalton's body around, and he smacked the last soldier square in the forehead. Like the leader, he flew back several feet, then hit the ground and didn't move. In what Dalton knew was just seconds, the 3 armed soldiers surrounded him, though this time it was on their backs, staring sightlessly into the gloom of the morning. He expected to feel something. Remorse for taking a life, perhaps? Guilt for the same? Regret for taking men away from loved ones? But he just felt relieved and empowered. He fought a grin as he lifted the impossibly glowing cross, but it was back to its former wall decoration self. Just a heavy piece of wood with a bit of the decorative metal. There wasn't even any blood on it. The thought of what he'd just done, and the likely gore, kept his eyes away from the soldiers. He looked up to ask Jeremiah the question, what just happened? But the man was gone. Dalton didn't know how long he stood there, just a few yards inside Mexico, in a circle of dead enemies as he thought about what had happened. His mind just couldn't wrap itself around all the questions. No, he told himself. It can't wrap itself around the answers. He'd killed for the first time in his life and didn't regret it. Why was that? Because Jeremiah said they'd been judged for their thoughts against me. He shook his head. Jeremiah had impossibly appeared just when Dalton had needed help, and exactly where he'd be. And even weirder was the fact he'd been glowing, and huge, like an angel. Another head shake followed that thought. He was suddenly tired, and he pulled his backpack around so he could tuck the cross back inside. He handled the thing carefully, knowing it was actually a formidable weapon. There was no way he himself could have swung hard enough to kill 3 men with one blow. Even before, he'd never been one to work out. He had no muscle tone whatsoever, and now with being half-starved, it was even less. The water jug caught his eye, and he was suddenly parched. He took it out, pulled off his scarf, and took a very long drink. He then held the jug up. It was dark blue, somewhat in the shape of a pitcher and made from plastic. There was nothing special about it, yet the water always stayed cool and full. For weeks, he'd wondered at that, though he didn't let his mind venture too deep into that territory. Another answer he wasn't sure he wanted. Dalton put the jug away, then tied the scarf back on. He stared ahead at the Jeep. He wondered how many vehicles these so-called peacekeepers had, and why did they have fuel? If they were the government, then he supposed they had access to all the resources. But why weren't they sharing with the people who were suffering so much? He shrugged the questions away. The only thing he knew was that he wasn't going to walk all the way across Mexico. As he tossed his pack into the back and climbed into the driver's seat, he looked around one more time for Jeremiah, though he didn't see him. But Dalton had a feeling he'd be there when he needed him. End of Soul Pirate, Book 1. Does Dalton ever turn back to the Lord? And is Jeremiah an actual angel? If you want to find out, go to vjdunn.com to continue a Restless Soul series with Soul Custody.